The biggest mystery surrounding Silo the 17th of may not be what destroyed it. It may be what the founders wanted everyone to believe was destroyed with it. Because when you look closely at what happened inside Silo 17, the flooding starts to feel less like the final consequence of a disaster and more like the perfect cover for something that was never supposed to be discovered. Juliet has already learned that the silos are not simply isolated underground cities. They are controlled environments built around secrets, surveillance, memory manipulation, and information that the people living inside them were never meant to access. So why would Silo 17 be any different? And more importantly, why does so much of its history seem to disappear beneath the water? The obvious explanation is that Silo 17 failed, the lower levels flooded, and the survivors adapted. But Silo has never been interested in obvious explanations. The deeper question is what was already down there before the water came. Silo 17 has always felt different from the other silos because it carries the scars of a civilization that collapsed in a way the inhabitants themselves don't fully understand. The water isn't just a physical obstacle. It has become a boundary between what the survivors know and what they don't. The higher levels tell one story. The lower levels tell another story. And somewhere underneath all of it is the possibility that the founders deliberately separated the two. That's important, because the entire silo system is built around controlling access. People are told what they need to know. Certain technologies are restricted. Certain historical records disappear. Certain areas are forbidden. Even basic questions about the world outside can be treated as dangerous. So if the founders had something they considered more dangerous than the truth about the outside world, where would they put it? Somewhere nobody could reach. Somewhere physically hostile. Somewhere that could be explained away as a disaster. And a flooded section of Silo 17 would be almost perfect. The first clue is the way Silo 17's destruction functions in the larger story.
Lucas Kyle and Patrick Kennedy will never make it to Silo 17.
If the flooding were simply the result of neglect or structural failure, then the water would be nothing more than evidence of the silo's collapse. But if the founders understood that the lower levels could be flooded or isolated, then the water becomes something else. A barrier. A barrier is not the same thing as destruction. Something can survive behind a barrier. Information can survive. Equipment can survive. A facility can survive. And that's where the idea of a hidden vault becomes interesting. The founders wouldn't necessarily need to destroy whatever they were hiding. They only needed to make sure nobody could reach it. Think about the logic of the silo system itself. The founders were obsessed with containment. They created an entire society designed to prevent people from leaving, prevent people from remembering too much, and prevent people from connecting the dots between their existence and the world that came before. That level of control requires infrastructure. It requires systems that exist outside the normal lives of the residents. And it raises a question that the series keeps quietly pushing toward us. How much of the original silo infrastructure is still operating beneath the world people actually see? We know the inhabitants occupy only certain portions of these enormous structures. We know there are restricted areas. We know there are forgotten technologies. And we know that the people in charge don't necessarily understand everything that the founders built. So the possibility of an untouched section beneath Silo 17 is not some random fantasy. It fits the logic of the world. And this is where the water becomes the most suspicious part. Because water destroys evidence. It ruins paper. It damages electronics. It erases markings. It makes exploration dangerous. It forces people to turn back. It creates an environment where even reaching a doorway can become an expedition. If you wanted to hide something for generations, you wouldn't necessarily bury it in a secret room behind a bookshelf. You would put it somewhere nobody could survive long enough to search properly. The lower levels of Silo 17 could function as a natural vault precisely because almost nobody is capable of reaching them. And if the people living above believe that everything below is simply flooded and dead, they wouldn't even think to ask what might still be there. That changes the meaning of Silo 17 completely. It means the silo's most important secret could literally be beneath the survivors' feet. And there is another reason this theory matters. The founders didn't just build one silo, they built an entire network. That means the things we discover in one silo can potentially explain the architecture of all the others. If Silo 17 contains something unusual, we shouldn't automatically treat it as an isolated mystery. It could be a piece of the larger system. Maybe the silo wasn't simply designed to house people. Maybe different sections were built for different functions. Storage, communication, monitoring, research, emergency control, data preservation. And if one of those functions became too dangerous, the founders could have sealed it off. The most frightening possibility is that the vault doesn't contain something physical at all. It could contain information. Imagine an archive that predates the current generation of silo residents. Records showing exactly why the silo system was created. Records showing what happened before the inhabitants were sealed underground. Records explaining what the founders knew about the outside world. Or even worse, records showing that the official history given to everyone inside the silo is not simply incomplete. It is deliberately manufactured. That would make the vault more dangerous than any weapon, because you can control a population that doesn't know the truth. You cannot control them once they have proof. And that is exactly why Juliet is such a threat. Juliet doesn't accept explanations just because someone in authority gives them to her. She investigates. She takes things apart. She follows physical evidence. She enters places she's not supposed to enter. That's why her journey through Silo 17 matters so much. She isn't just discovering another damaged silo. She's entering a physical record of what happens when the system breaks down. Every abandoned hallway, every forgotten object, every inaccessible section becomes evidence. And if there really is something hidden beneath the water, Juliet is precisely the kind of person who would eventually find it. But there is an even bigger possibility. What if the founders expected someone like Juliet to come looking? This is where the theory gets darker. The silo system has survived for generations. That means its creators had to anticipate failure. They had to know that eventually something would go wrong. A rebellion could happen. A silo could lose control. An engineer could discover too much. A mechanical system could fail. A group could refuse to follow the rules. The founders couldn't simply assume that every silo would remain perfectly obedient forever. So what if Silo 17's hidden section was part of an emergency protocol? Not a vault designed to protect the residents, a vault designed to protect the system. Perhaps something was placed there because the founders knew that if a silo ever collapsed, certain information or technology would need to remain inaccessible. The water could then serve as the final layer of security. The silo doesn't have to remain intact. The people don't have to survive. The secret only has to remain buried. And that would explain why the ruins of Silo 17 could be more valuable than a functioning silo. A functioning silo tells us what the founders want people to see. A broken silo tells us what happens when their control fails. That's why Silo 17 is so important. It is evidence. And evidence is exactly what the silo system fears. There's also a fascinating connection between physical isolation and psychological control. The residents of the silo are taught to fear certain areas because they have been told those places are dangerous. Over generations, that fear becomes tradition. Nobody remembers why they're forbidden. They simply know they're forbidden. That's how the founders maintain control without having to constantly enforce every rule themselves. The residents become the guards of their own prison. Now imagine applying that same principle to the flooded levels. You don't need to post guards outside a submerged vault. You don't need soldiers. You don't need cameras. You simply need everyone to believe there is nothing worth finding down there. And suddenly, the water becomes psychological as well as physical. The survivors don't just fear drowning. They fear what they might discover. And that may be exactly what the founders intended. This also gives us a possible explanation for why Silo 17 feels like a warning. Its collapse demonstrates what happens when the social system breaks down. But the deeper mystery is whether the collapse actually exposed something the founders wanted to keep hidden. Maybe the silo's destruction wasn't the end of its story. Maybe it was the moment its secret became vulnerable. And if Juliet reaches that secret, the consequences won't stay inside Silo 17. Because information moves differently from people. A person can be trapped in a silo. A truth cannot. Once Juliet learns something that proves the founders manipulated the history of the silo system, she doesn't need to convince everyone immediately. She only needs enough evidence to make the official story impossible to defend. That could be far more dangerous than any rebellion. A rebellion can be crushed. A piece of undeniable evidence is much harder to kill. And this is where I think the hidden vault theory becomes connected to the larger mystery of Silo. The question isn't simply what is outside. We've been asking that question for a long time. The more important question is who decided that humanity needed to live like this in the first place? Because whoever created the silo system didn't simply hide humanity underground. They designed a civilization around controlled ignorance. They built rules specifically to prevent curiosity from becoming knowledge. They created systems that regulate reproduction, technology, history, communication, and movement. That level of engineering suggests that the founders were not merely trying to save people, they were trying to control what people would become. And if Silo 17 contains a hidden vault, perhaps that's where we finally see the difference between those two goals. Maybe the founders weren't protecting humanity from the truth. Maybe they were protecting their experiment from humanity. That possibility changes everything. Because if the silo system were an experiment, then the residents wouldn't be prisoners in the traditional sense. They're subjects. And Juliet is becoming the variable the experiment was never designed to handle. She asks questions. She crosses boundaries. She survives places other people cannot. And most importantly, she keeps discovering that the rules are hiding something. So the next time we look at the flooded section of Silo 17, we shouldn't just see water. We should see a locked door. A door the founders never expected anyone to open. And if there really is a vault beneath that water, I don't think the biggest reveal will be some random piece of technology or forgotten artifact. I think it will explain why the silo system exists. It could tell Juliet what happened before the silos. It could reveal what the founders knew. It could expose the real purpose of the underground cities. And it could finally answer the question that has been hanging over this entire story. Were the people of the silos saved from the outside world, or were they deliberately hidden from it? Because those two possibilities sound almost identical, but they lead to completely different truths. And if the founders buried something beneath Silo 17, they may have made one enormous mistake. They assumed the water would keep people away forever. They didn't account for Juliet Nichols. And once Juliet reaches whatever is waiting beneath that water, the secret of Silo the 17th of may not stay buried. It may become the evidence that finally brings the entire silo system down.